This is the guide to AIP flours. When you get into the autoimmune paleo diet, it can get a little confusing with all of the new flours that you are presented with that are completely different than anywhere else. So I wanted to give you this guide that's going to go in depth into the 5 main AIP flours. These flours are arrowroot starch, cassava flour, coconut flour, tapioca starch, and tigernut flour. So let's go ahead and get started. The first flour we're going to talk about is arrowroot. This is also known as arrowroot powder, arrowroot starch, and arrowroot flour, and sometimes just plain arrowroot, but they're all the same thing. It's a fine white powder that is very light and kind of sticky when you rub it together between your fingers. Arrowroot starch is harvested from a tropical plant called the Maranta arundinacea. I probably butchered that. It's just the starch that has been extracted from the root of the plant, dried, and ground into a powder. Arrowroot powder is a pretty mild, bland flour that doesn't impart much or any taste into your recipes. Arrowroot has quite a few uses. Number 1, thickening. It can be used to thicken gravies, stews, and sauces, and is a great substitution for cornstarch in recipes for dishes like this. If you do go about replacing cornstarch in a favorite recipe though, start with about a half of the amount and go up from there, because it can get pretty gloppy if you get too much. A good practice is to make a slurry by mixing some water, milk, or a small amount of the liquid you're going to thicken in a separate bowl with the arrowroot. This will help prevent clumps of the arrowroot starch, which are not very pleasant to eat, and clumps don't wind up thickening the sauce. I also find that the mixture needs to get hot before it really thickens, so make sure to do this over the stove. However, don't leave it on for longer than like a few minutes, as it'll break down again. So like a minute or two right before taking your stew or your sauce or whatever off the stove works great. It can also survive a freeze-thaw cycle, unlike cornstarch, so it's a great thing if you're going to be freezing and cooking and then reheating this dish as well. The second use for arrowroot is crisping. Because it's a straight starch, it can help things crisp up. One example of this is sweet potato fries. Before putting your homemade sweet potato fries in the oven, toss them with about a tablespoon of arrowroot powder, and they'll crisp up a lot nicer than without it. It can also help crisp up proteins like a crispy coating on chicken. You can just dip the chicken in the arrowroot starch with salt and seasonings before pan frying. I have a recipe on my site for fried chicken burgers that uses this technique. It does call for tapioca starch, but arrowroot can be a good substitute for that, and I'll get more on that in a minute. The third use for arrowroot is in baked goods. You'll often find arrowroot combined with the other flours in baked goods because it doesn't work so well as a straight starch on its own, but combined with fibrous and protein-filled flours, it can really shine. As for substitutions, it is not a good substitute for wheat flour in regular baked goods, though, since it's all starch and doesn't have the same qualities. So don't try to make your own favorite or your grandma's recipe using this. And as for the substitution with tapioca starch that I just mentioned, I'll get more into tapioca starch later, but it's a very similar starch to arrowroot, and they are often used as a substitute for one another. They can usually be used 1-for-1 in the same ratio for each other in recipes. So if you have an intolerance to tapioca, arrowroot can be a good choice. And when it comes to whether there are a difference between the quality, consistency, etc. between brands, I really don't find that much of a difference. The brands all seem to be pretty similar, so just get whatever you can find. Typically, arrowroot starch can be found in the baking aisles in most stores these days, sometimes in the alternative flour section. Otherwise, you should be able to find it online. And as for making your own, I couldn't really find that many recipes on making your own arrowroot powder, and it looks like it might be kind of difficult getting it to the same powdery consistency as store-bought anyway. Because it's not overly expensive and it's pretty easy to find, I recommend just buying it. The next flour, cassava flour, has become quite a popular grain-free flour in recent years. Though in more tropical locales like South America, Asia, and Africa, it's been a staple for a long time. Cassava flour is made from the root of the cassava plant, which is also known as yucca, manioc, manihot esculenta, and mandioca. It's a soft, light tan, or cream-colored, high-fiber flour that's heavier than the starches like arrowroot and tapioca starch, and has a bit of a nutty, almost earthy taste. You can often taste this in your finished dishes, so keep that in mind. I personally think it's a bit of an acquired taste. I didn't like it so much at first, but now I love it. The flour is made by peeling, drying, and grounding the entire cassava root. This is a very important thing to note, as I often get the question of whether or not you can just use tapioca flour instead of cassava flour in recipes, and the answer is no. Cassava flour is the whole root of the cassava plant. Tapioca is just the starch extracted from the cassava root. Therefore, they act completely differently when used in certain recipes and cannot be used as substitutes for each other. It's the most like wheat flour out of the AIP flours though, and in fact can be used one for wheat flour in many recipes. I however find this to be a little less consistent with the AIP and vegan sorts of recipes that don't use eggs for binders. However, it's one of the only AIP flours that can be successfully used on its own without other flours and starches. Uses include all manner of baked goods, tortillas, pasta, pancakes, waffles, pizza crust, pies, and raw things like edible cookie dough. Basically, many of the things you typically find made with wheat flour, you can also find made with cassava flour. Also note that often cassava flour baked goods, and this is also true with arrowroot and tapioca baked goods as well, can be a little gummy when done. This is normal, but takes a lot of people off guard when they aren't expecting it. This can be an advantage though when making some dishes that you want to have a melted cheese-like texture though. Cassava is also high in carbohydrates, so it's a good candidate for moderation in your diet. Don't just replace a diet of wheat flour-based baked goods, pastas, and tortillas every day with cassava flour alternatives. This won't help your healing and may just cause you to have blood sugar issues and cravings for a lot longer than you need. That all being said, it does make some amazing AIP alternatives, some of which are quite exciting, like Lovebird cereal, Jovial's cassava flour pastas, and recipes like my AIP flatbreads, cassava flour pancakes, Downshiftology's cassava flour tortillas, and so much more. And here we come to the differences between brands. I've noticed that as more and more brands start making cassava flour, that the actual end product tends to be pretty inconsistent. I don't know if they're all using different processes to create the flour or what, but it can be quite frustrating and expensive when you try to make a cassava flour recipe and it doesn't come out. Therefore, if a blogger or recipe specifically mentions a brand, it's best if you can use that particular brand in the recipe that you're making. This isn't to say it won't come out if you use another brand, but chances are that if you didn't use exactly the one they tested with, you may not get the results you expect. As for where to buy, it may be a little bit harder to find cassava flour in stores. Some natural food stores like Whole Foods, Natural Grocers, and Sprouts may have them in their baking sections, but many mainstream stores may not. It's becoming more prevalent though, so you may be able to find it somewhere. You should be able to find it in some Asian and ethnic markets, and online there's no problem. That's usually where I get it. And as for making your own, you can make your own cassava flour if you wish by boiling the root, then drying it in a dehydrator or oven, and then grinding it down to a flour. I'll link to a recipe below by Predominantly Paleo if you'd like to give it a try. The next flour is coconut flour. This is a creamed colored, often clumpy powder that's a lot more gritty than the powdery starches. It's made from ground up dried coconut meat. It sometimes can have some coconut flavor, but it's usually not that noticeable, especially if you use it with other flavors in a recipe. You'll find that you may taste it more in a recipe made with all coconut flour than one with just a few tablespoons of it in it. Coconut flour is completely unlike wheat flour and acts differently than most other flours when used in recipes. This means it cannot be substituted for any other flour, nor any flour for it, unless used in some very specific situations, like breading a chicken. Because it soaks up so much liquid when used in a recipe, it A, needs a lot of liquid to work with, and B, doesn't work like cassava flour, wheat flour, almond flour, or any of the other grain-free or gluten-free flours. As for uses, it is often mixed with other flours in baked goods like cakes, muffins, and cookies. It can also make some bread-like products. Usually in baking, you'll find that you only need a few tablespoons of coconut flour. However, some recipes do use majority of coconut flour as well. But those typically will be more of a paleo type recipe and not AIP, as they usually need a lot of eggs to work well. That all being said, you only typically need a quarter of what you would need in regular wheat flour based recipe. And like I mentioned earlier, it usually needs a lot of liquid to avoid being extremely dry. This often causes the end product of a primarily coconut flour baked good to to be a little bit spongier than baked goods made with cassava flour or wheat flour. However, some recipes don't use liquids at all and still work, like my AIP Lavender Shortbread cookies, for example. You can also use coconut flour for breading proteins, and it works rather well for this, though it doesn't get crispy like arrowroot or tapioca starch. It's more like wheat flour in this situation. Coconut flour is a high fiber flour with some protein as well. This is important to note as the type of fiber is a prebiotic fiber called inulin fiber. Prebiotics are great for you and feed your gut bacteria, but sometimes this can cause a negative reaction in some people with an off-balance gut flora. Reactions include gas, bloating, and sometimes other GI symptoms after eating something made with coconut flour or any coconut products really. If this is you, either avoid coconut flour or use only small amounts and see if you can work your way up to more as you heal your gut and restore a beneficial balance of gut flora. Because of the tricky nature of this flour, I do not recommend experimenting with coconut flour on your own until you've had quite a few tried and true coconut flour recipes first. Get to understand the liquid to flour ratios, what the recipe developer used to make it work, what the texture of the finished products usually are like, and all of that first. Then try to make stuff on your own if you'd like. And some other tips when it comes to coconut flour are, it's a good idea when using coconut flour to sift it as clumps are pretty common. And the batters of primarily coconut flour baked goods may be a lot thicker than you're used to. This is normal. You may need to spoon the batter into muffin cups or into a skillet instead of pouring. Also, many recipes will call for letting the batter sit at room temperature for at least 10 minutes to let the liquids absorb. Do not skip this step if it calls for it, as the item may not cook properly. As for a difference between brands, I've used quite a few brands of coconut flour, plus also made my own, and I don't find a huge difference between them. So, unlike cassava flour, you should be fine with any brand. However, I do caution you to find brands that are sustainably sourced and use fair trade practices, as the more coconut products gain popularity, the more there are some unscrupulous sources out there that take advantage of farmers, land, and are even forcing monkeys to pick the coconuts. So it does pay to do your research to make sure you're not supporting that. I've found it pretty easy to find coconut flour in stores these days. Natural markets like Whole Foods, Natural Grocers, and Sprouts almost always have it, but I've also seen it in many mainstream markets as well. It's usually in the alternative flour section of baking aisles there. You can find it in Asian and ethnic markets and online as well. And you can also make your own coconut flour, which does help to cut down on the expense. And to do so, you just need to dry the pulp left over from making homemade coconut milk. Just dry the leftover pulp in a dehydrator or in an oven at low heat until completely dry, then blend it with a blender or food processor into a fine powder. Okay, now we're going to talk about tapioca flour, which I've mentioned several times already. It is also called tapioca starch, tapioca powder, and just tapioca. These are not to be confused with tapioca pearls, bubbles, flakes, or sticks, which are a different form of this starch. Tapioca flour is a very similar flour in appearance to arrowroot starch. They're both light, fine white powders that tend to go poof up into a cloud when poured or handled roughly. So I recommend gently pouring any tapioca flours, or arrowroot starch for that matter, into your recipes with care, or else you can end up covered in the stuff. Like cassava flour, it is also made from the root of the cassava plant. But unlike cassava flour, which is made from the entire ground up cassava root, tapioca is made by washing, pulping, and pressing the cassava root. The liquid pressed from the pulp is then evaporated, leaving only the dried starch behind. This is the tapioca starch. So as I mentioned in the cassava flour section, tapioca starch and cassava flour cannot be substituted for each other, nor can you simply just replace the amount of cassava flour in a recipe with more tapioca flour. This will just not work. However, sometimes if you do go to an Asian market or an ethnic market, you may find something marked as tapioca starch or flour that is actually cassava flour. I admit, it is all very confusing and frustrating. It's best if you're making a lot of recipes to make sure you're getting the right thing, which may mean buying it from more mainstream markets if possible. But in either case, if it's super snow white and really, really fine, it's probably tapioca starch that we're talking about in this section. If it's a creamier light tan color, it's probably cassava flour. Like I mentioned in the arrowroot powder section, Tapioca starch can usually be substituted for arrowroot at a ratio of 1:1 in many recipes. As for uses, it can be used similarly to arrowroot powder, but I prefer tapioca over arrowroot for crisping things like fried crust on a chicken breast, as it seems to work better for this. It can help crisp up pie crusts and other baked goods, but also you'll often find tapioca starch in baking and bread recipes alongside other flours to help it give a chewy and light quality. Trust me, before we figured out how to do this a few years ago, things were a lot more dense. Plus, tapioca also helps to prevent the baked goods from becoming soggy after baking, which is another good thing. Tapioca starch can also help thicken gravies, stews, and sauces. However, I find arrowroot to be better at this. But like arrowroot powder, if you're going to add it to these things to thicken them, do so by making a slurry first. And also like arrowroot starch, it can withstand a freeze-thaw cycle. So if you cook something, freeze it, and then reheat it, it should still retain the thickness. Tapioca also can be used as a binder in place of wheat flour in ground meat products like meatballs. And because it gelatinizes so well when heated with a liquid, it makes a good dairy-free cheese, believe it or not. I will link to a great tapioca cheese recipe by The Curious Coconut below. Just like cassava flour, it is pretty much 100% carbohydrate, so just be mindful of this during your consumption of it so that you don't overdo it. It also doesn't really have much in the way of nutrition either, so again, just be mindful. As for differences between brands, unlike cassava flour, tapioca starch seems to be really consistent across brands, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. And typically tapioca starch can be found in the baking aisles in most stores these days, sometimes in the alternative flour section. Otherwise, you should be able to find it at ethnic markets, Asian markets, and online. And as for making your own, extracting the starch from the cassava root is an involved process, so I don't recommend doing it on your own unless you're really motivated. Perhaps one of those I can say I did it type things. However, you can make flour from tapioca pearls if you are in a pinch. And the last of our 5 main flours is Tigernut Flour. A relative newcomer to the gluten and grain-free world, Tigernut Flour has been seeing a lot more popularity these days. Tiger nuts are not as well known in the US as they are in other parts of the world, where they've also been called things like chufa, ground nuts, yellow nut sedges, and earth almonds. Tigernut flour is a light brown, slightly sweet, slightly nutty, slightly grainy flour. The flour is made typically from grinding whole tiger nuts, but also could be made from dried pulp left over from tiger nut milk. Tiger nuts, despite the very confusing name, are not nuts. They're small tubers, root vegetables, sort of like sweet potatoes. Because they're not nuts, they make a great flour for those with nut sensitivities, allergies, and anyone on a nut-free diet like AIP. It is not a good substitute for wheat flour in most recipes, so I wouldn't even bother trying it with your favorite non-AIP recipes. It can be used as a substitute for cassava flour in some recipes, as well as almond flour in some paleo and grain-free recipes, but not all. Again, just like coconut flour, I recommend you try a few Tigernut flour recipes first to learn what the texture is like and how the recipe developer uses it before trying it on your own. As for uses, it's a pretty dry flour and doesn't absorb liquids very well, so it typically is used with other flours, especially the starchier ones, to keep things from crumbling. As a result, it's best used in baked goods and bread-like things like crepes, but also cookies, pancakes, and waffles. Because of the sweet flavor, it's more suited for sweeter things rather than savory ones, since the flavor does come through. Like coconut flour, it is high in protein and fiber, so it can cause gas and bloating if your gut flora is in balance. So do watch out for that and eat it in moderation or omit it if necessary until your gut heals. However, I found that many who have issues with coconut can tolerate tiger nuts a lot better, so if you do have issues with coconut flour, try a small amount of Tigernut flour first to see what happens. And it can sometimes be pretty grainy, especially if it's not cooked, so keep that in mind if using it in raw applications. You can sift it to help with this though. But it also does make some great raw things, like my 30-second Tigernut Butter, which is a great AIP-friendly nut butter substitute. And as for the difference between brands, I really haven't found much of a difference between brands, so I don't think at the moment you need to worry about this much. And buying Tigernut flour, it's the only flour on this main list of 5 main AIP flours that I've never found in a local store and have only gotten online. I'll list my favorite options for where to get it below, but Shop AIP and Amazon have usually been where I get it. And I saw recently that Thrive Market is now actually selling a version under their own brand. I hope that as it gains popularity as a grain-free, nut-free flour, that it'll be much more readily available in stores. You can make your own Tigernut flour by one of two ways. The first way is by taking the leftover pulp from homemade Tigernut milk and dehydrating it or drying it at a low temperature in your oven until dry. Then you put it in a blender or food processor and blend until it's a powder. It probably won't get as fine as store-bought Tigernut flour, but it will still work great, and you'll get both Tigernut milk and Tigernut flour from one batch of whole Tigernuts. This version of Tigernut flour is higher in fiber and lower in carbs than the Tigernut flour made from whole nuts, so do take that into account if you have any sort of gas, bloating, or GI distress after. You can also blend whole Tigernuts to make flour, but you need a high-speed, powerful blender to do this to make sure that you're going to get a flour and not just a coarse meal. I find it easier just to buy flour due to the issues with consistency in making your own Tigernut flour this way. Plus, I don't think it's any cheaper than buying pre-made flour. But you can make it this way if you choose. So those were the main top 5 flours you'll see in most AIP recipes. There are others, a few of which I'll briefly touch on in a minute. They are typically harder to find and can be quite expensive depending on what it is. So many recipe developers avoid using them because they aren't as available and harder to source. Some are becoming more easily found though, so they may become more popular. Some of these more specialty flours include ones like green banana flour, plantain flour, cricket flour, yes, that's made from crickets, pumpkin flour, squash flour, sweet potato flour, sweet potato starch, and water chestnut flour, and taro flour. So I'm not going to go into how to use each of these, partially because, to be honest, I'm not even sure how to use most of them. I've made a few recipes with some of them, but nothing I've been overly impressed with, so I've kind of stuck with the main 5 flours anyway, and it seems that most recipe developers do as well, since there are so few recipes out there for these other flours. But do note that they are available for you if you need them. One note I do have for cricket flour, which is a high-protein flour popular with athletes, is that apparently some of them are fed diets of corn and wheat, so this may or may not affect you. If you want to watch a funny video, check out Stacy at Real World AIP's video where she tried to make her own cricket flour. Not something she nor I suggest. I hope that gave you a good foundation on all of the different AIP flours, what the main 5 ones were, and then some of the other specialty ones. And if you haven't already, make sure you get the password to my Paleo and AIP Freebie library with all sorts of great resources in it. I will put the link below, and I'll see you next time.